The Historical Society of Ottawa acknowledges that as we share these stories from our past, we are on what remains the unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. This series is a collaboration between the Historical Society of Ottawa and Rogers TV. I'm Ben Weiss. I'm with the Historical Society of Ottawa, where we've been telling Ottawa's great story since 1898. If you find Ottawa history as fascinating as we do, I urge you to check out our website, our monthly speaker series, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And enjoy today's segment.
Hello, my name is Paul Couvrette. I'm a photographer in Ottawa, Canada. Today I'm going to talk about the history of photography in Ottawa, primarily portrait photography and commercial photography, but also segue through a range of topics that we'll see how far I can go with new technology, pivoting, the whole works. So let's get started. Photography was basically invented in 1839 in France. In Canada, some of the first portrait studios came into being in the 1850s, 1860s. Ottawa had already had visits from some amazing, remarkable photographers, primarily from Montreal, who were documenting the city prior to the city being named the capital of Canada. So they came, shot the city, shot Parliament Hill, and then continued on photographing the construction of the Parliament buildings for many, many years, including some pictures I have of my great-great-great-grandfather, who was one of the original builders of Parliament in the 1860s and was called back in the 1919s to rebuild Parliament after it burned down. Yeah, that's quite a separate second historical story. Photography, there were many, many studios. The primary ones that I know of are the Lockwood Studios, and that was, I believe, 1870s. And they did portraits primarily. They probably started with daguerreotypes. The father then passed on, and his daughter, Elvira Lockwood, became one of the first female photographers in North America. She carried on her studio for many, many, many years, and is somewhat forgotten and not honored. I looked her up. I'm a bit of a researcher, a history buff, and a nut for research. And I discovered that, curiously enough, there are no plaques to her honor, but also she is buried in an unmarked grave in Beechwood Cemetery. This topic is kind of interesting because right now I'm just about to have a major fight with various city organizations who do not wish to honor my friend Malik Karsh. Malik Karsh was the man who originated the Tulip Festival, brought massive quantities of tourism to Ottawa. His face was everywhere. He created our currency, and the city has apparently no funds to put a little statue up. We've already got the statue made. They just haven't the money to put it up. But that's another topic. I segue quite a lot, don't mind me. Basically, from the 19th century on through, photography evolved many, many, many times. It was first daguerreotypes, then it was prints. And what most people don't realize, at one point in the downtown core alone, there were probably as many as 10 or 12 photo studios. At least 6 were on Spark Street. And it's incredible to think of that many photo studios downtown. Technically now, there's only one, and that in fact would be me. I've been in business for 50 years, starting this year. Basically did a degree in journalism at Carleton, and ended up somehow moving to London to make my fame. Worked in the world's first camera store on Bond Street, and proceeded to meet a lot of wealthy, famous people. Among others, and I'll try to cut this short, among others I met the royal family, and in fact was asked to teach the Queen photography, which I did. That in itself is a whole story. From there, my career started to to move in England, and this transferred eventually, by the way, to Canada, where I was later asked by the royal family to cover all their royal tours, and in fact, to cover the signing of the proclamation that made us Canada. But that's another story too. I have a million of them. I realized that in London I would have trouble making enough money to live well. So I came back to Canada with $300 and started a studio in the basement of a little apartment building. From there, good luck followed me. Maybe good luck, I'm not sure. I happened to be a writer-photographer and met many famous Canadian photographers. I worked with many people in Ottawa who were photographers, who were commercial photographers. Andrews Newton was on Spark Street. They'd been there forever. And Andrews Newton stuff, the city archives is full of their work. And I worked with them a bit. I worked with the media because I had a degree in journalism. I was a photojournalist. One day I got asked to do an assignment at the Shadow of a famous photographer, Roloff Benny, whose book was just being produced. So I went to the Shadow and decided to bring a giant 4x5 camera. I don't know what got into my head, but decided to bring this giant camera and heavy-duty lighting to do this very simple journalistic portrait for the Ottawa Citizen. Well, in the middle of this session, who should I turn and look to my left and notice but is Joseph Karsh, who was a friend of Roloff Benny. Karsh, of course, is Karsh of Ottawa. He and his brother are two of the most famous photographers in North America, maybe the world. Karsh watched me, didn't say boo, but at the end of it all, he said, you know, what an interesting young man, you should come to dinner with us. And I was sort of shocked, right, to even meet him. And I did. I went home, changed, went back, met them at the Shadow, and we were driven in a limousine to the Persian embassy, where I met all sorts of people that somehow thought I was this amazing photographer because I was brought there by Karsh. In any event, the story moves on, and then I ran into a whole series of lucky things that just occurred to me all through. You got to realize back then in Ottawa there were maybe 25 photographers, maybe 15 commercial photographers, and the rest were portrait and wedding people. I got lucky. I somehow got, you know, embraced by various ethnic communities, the Jewish, the Lebanese, and my business took off. At one point I had half a dozen photographers working for me. At that point, there were, in the mid-'80s, the wedding business was booming. It was great. And that's when it became very profitable. I renovated my own building on Florence, and by the early 90s, I was rolling along, and suddenly I started to sense a change. Previously, people had, of course, simply taken pictures, sold prints, away it went. I started to research something in the digital world because I had shot for Nortel. I was the guy that they paid to go in and do these shots that went worldwide about their stuff. I also started to play with computers, and at that time, I discovered that a friend of mine in California was working on programs, and I started to advise him and beta test for him. And that program was called Photoshop. And so basically I had Photoshop 1 in my studio, which you loaded with 8 diskettes. It was pretty funny. Anyway, this went on, and really what I also want to talk about is the notion of segueing, pivoting. I pivoted at least 3 or 4 times from 35mm cameras, which everyone was using, to Hasselblads. By the 90s, by the mid-90s, I pivoted and learned about digital, and photography changed dramatically. In 1995, 1996, a whole bunch of photographers said, we're sticking with film. I built a website. About 3 months after a guy named Bill Gates built one for his company called Microsoft. Right, that's who they were. And about a year later, I got a call from Germany, excuse me, and they said, we would like you to come and give a talk. I was like, oh my God. I started getting calls from the US as well about the digital world. And what happened was that suddenly Agfa, which is a major digital company, hired me to be their digital spokesperson. So I spent the next 4 years traveling around North America talking about the upcoming digital revolution, which nobody really, I think, believed half the stuff we were saying, but I knew it was all coming. So then things transitioned, and I started to realize that by 2000, I connected with Corel, who were a client, and we started selling our images online, technically through CD-ROMs, and this just boomed. It was crazy. Stuff I had in my files that I didn't think was worth anything suddenly was worth something. So we basically had a heyday of photography back in those days. I segued also from the magazine industry. Now, in Canada, magazines paid moderately well. I basically hunted down the magazines that paid the most, which were Time and Newsweek, and began shooting for Time and Newsweek in Canada. Those were the heydays of photography and of all media, let's face it. And what happened was that I traveled around Canada for Time, shot amazing people, amazing events. But then the party started to be over, and I segued again into heavy-duty commercial photography. I had always thought that I could be versatile enough to shoot this stuff, but I proved it to myself by hitting all the major ad agencies in the US and began this very large business shooting commercial photography for the top 10 ad agencies in North America, including a couple that were the biggest in the world. So this rolled on, and then suddenly we had many years of great biz and whatnot, and then the digital revolution really technically just slammed photography. From about 2010 on, the concept of photography changed dramatically. And what happened was that everybody had a cell phone, not that they could take great pictures, but it devalued the art and the craft of it greatly. I used to get cranky about it. Now, you know, I go on Instagram and look at the pictures, and they're great. But at the time, I thought, oh my good grief, what's going to happen when everyone starts shooting really good pictures with these phones? Well, what happened is, of course, that you can now go to a stock photography site and buy a fantastic picture of prominent buildings for 50 cents. Well, 25 years ago, I would have charged $500 for that, as would have any other photographer in Canada. So this changed dramatically, and a series of other things moved in. I mean, AI is moving in right now, and that's a whole other topic. I work with AI. I started playing with AI about 5 years ago, and I basically do work for people all around the globe via AI. I edit pictures, I do all sorts of things. So what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. You have to adapt, you have to pivot. And that's really the story of this industry incredibly. I guess technological industries all have this problem. The media has this problem. We all do. It's as simple as that. I'd like to talk about a number of the more famous photographers in the history of Ottawa. Ottawa basically was, shall we say, hunted by a range of photographers prior to it being the capital of Canada. One of them was William Notman, who came here in, I believe, the 1850s and photographed the landscape. And he is considered to be Canada's foremost architecture and landscape photography from that era. His work is heavily shown in the public archives, or you can simply look it up, but they're gorgeous black and whites. He was truly a very proficient technical artist. Topley was another, and some of these people had proteges who carried on in Ottawa after them. Elihu, I hope that's the way I pronounce his name, Spencer, was another prominent portrait photographer. And these people eventually, once Ottawa became the capital, brought lots of their proteges here and set up little studios and did everything from one end to the other. A lot of people don't realize that digital photography, this business of manipulating pictures, this was done back then. It's not a surprise. They used to take hundreds of portraits of people and make giant composites of people together going down in big sleds not far from here near Rideau Hall as giant panoramas for the Governor General's ball. And they used to put people into all sorts of situations that they would retouch. No one can believe this, but the amount of retouching back then was, in some cases, more than the amount of retouching right now. There was a studio on Bank Street that still has a sign. It's around Bank and a little north of Laurier, Hans Studio. At one point, they employed over 20 women, it was all women for one reason or another, to retouch portraits, primarily on the negatives, so they could make multiple prints. And this was one heck of a job. You have to be really talented to retouch. You would etch away parts of the negative. And the retouching of men in particular was for some strange reason done to the point where a 50-year-old businessman was made to look 30. So we see these filters on things today and we think, oh, that's really weird. It's not the first time this has ever been done. At some point, people always said, well, a photograph is the truth. There are many quotes about that. It's never been the truth, realistically. It's always been manipulated in one way, shape, or form. Now, another couple of photographers that I do want to talk about, of course, are the Karshes. Everybody wants to hear about the Karshes. I've got a million stories. I met Joseph, of course, at that time, but then I continued to do work at the Shadow and have all sorts of encounters with Karsh. Ottawa, I have to say, is a very tough city to do business in. It is one of the toughest cities you ever imagine. Basically, people buy based on the lowest price. I'm sorry to say, but that's how we got the LRT. So basically what happens is that Joseph realized that the way to make money was not do much work in Ottawa. And I still remember one day in the middle of February, many years back, I'm walking into the Shadow. Joseph is standing waiting for a taxi or something. I said, Mr. Karsh, you know, how you doing? It was like pouring drizzle, frozen rain on both of us. We're standing in there, and I said, I got to ask you, Mr. Karsh, why did you stay in Ottawa? What was the point of staying here? And he said, the weather. The man had a sense of humor. Now, Joseph literally lived and worked in the Shadow, of course, and he did travel all over the world doing portraits. He photographed the royal family and on and on and on. What was really interesting to me was after Joseph passed away, I was asked at 2 in the afternoon to basically write the piece in the Ottawa Citizen about Joseph Karsh. And when they called me, they said, well, we'd like you to write it. And I said, well, what's the deadline? And they said, well, 4. So I managed to, in a 2-hour span, write this piece off the top of my head, and I hadn't written for years. But it did work out. It was published, and that's the end of that story. Now, Malik, on the other hand, as mentioned, he basically created the Tulip Festival, but he created the notion of documenting industry in Canada. He was paid by the federal government, by, I believe, the National Film Board. And he traveled all across Canada, et cetera, et cetera. My meeting with Malik is an interesting story. Again, middle of winter in Ottawa, guess what? I'm driving down in front of the Parliament buildings. It's freezing, rain, again, snow, garbage, firing by. I'm the only car on the road who's crazy enough at 11 o'clock at night to be driving down. And I look to my right, I can barely see the eternal flame. Maybe now it's called something else, but anyway, the flame on Parliament Hill, Centennial Flame. And I look, and there's a guy on a step ladder looking down with a camera. I thought, oh, I gotta pull over and see this. I pull over, I walk up to this fellow who must have been in his mid-70s, and I said, Malik Karsh, I presume. And he looked at me, he said, how did you know? I said, because I'm Paul Couvrette and you're the only other person crazy enough to be out here in this weather. We became instant friends, and I had many, many meetings with him. Many times I met him on shoots, and eventually he reached the age where he wasn't shooting as much, and he had created the currency. And so one day I got a call from the Canadian Banknote Company to basically create new currency for Canada, and I was just like, wow. Last week Karsh sent me a portrait. Now the other Karsh is sending me work. So basically I created a whole range of Canadian currency based on Malik Karsh's recommendation. He was, as I say, an icon of our time, and if you see anything mentioned of the Tulip Festival, that was Malik Karsh. If you see anything mentioned of tourism in Ottawa, that started the big boom in tourism in Ottawa, because we had the canal and we had the Tulip Festival. Hundreds of thousands of people over the years came to Ottawa because of seeing those two things. And of course the tulips, in case anyone doesn't know this, were given to Canada because of the fact that Canada helped out the royal Dutch family during the Second World War. So Malik knew this, and he got the Dutch embassy to bring in all these tulips. As I say, Ottawa is famous. Go to the airport, the first thing you see is giant 10-foot pictures of tulips, still to this day. So those are two that I really did respect a lot. There are hundreds of others who made their day, made their time, but it's a brutal business. The number of people over the years that have risen up and fallen is huge. COVID, as I say, took down 8 or 9 of the top 10 people in Ottawa, primarily because they had commercial leases. But many others just faded away. Certainly Paul Horsdale is a name that comes to mind. Most people probably never heard of him. There are no monuments to him. But Paul Horsdale was in the 1940s and 50s. And curiously enough, his son is also an artist called Valdi. Many people don't know that, but Valdi was quite famous. But Paul Horsdale photographed the Supreme Court of Canada, the Federal Court of Canada, all sorts of MPs. Basically, when he retired, he passed a lot of those on to me as well. And I still remember seeing his work, and it was black and white, hand-printed work. And I still remember looking at these things, and I was like, wow, really a talent. One of my many regrets in life is not buying more prints from any of these people. It really is a case where, sadly, I only bought one print, and it was my favorite. And that was the print of Pablo Casals by Joseph Karsh. And it still hangs in my home. It's funny, I get called a lot about Karsh. It's quite amazing. People still remember Karsh. One of the funnier things that happened recently, well, not funny, but strange, is that Karsh's photographs were stolen from the Chateau Laurier. And I got calls from all the American newspapers, oh my God, do you have any idea how this happened, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually I said, well, obviously well planned. It was during COVID. I said, it's funny because I walked by those prints many, many, many times and thought, my God, they're held on by 2 screws, but whatever, I knew the value. Curiously enough, about a year later, it turns out that I'm in the Chateau waiting for somebody to come by. I'm introduced to a person, and I said, so what's your job here? And he says, well, I'm head of security. I said, oh boy, this is going to be a funny conversation. So I got time to kill. I said, so the Karsh robbery, any clues? He said, no, we've got nothing at all. It was obviously well planned, et cetera, et cetera. They took a print. They obviously photographed another print, enlarged it, framed it in almost the same manner, and must have come in with a screwdriver and went zing, zing, and put it into a suitcase, which there are many suitcases going by the Chateau Laurier. So I said to him, okay, well, I'm curious why you did not have better security, why you did not have these things bolted down. He said, well, we do now. And I said, but do you realize what that print was worth? And he said, well, you know, I don't know much about photography. You can make quite a few of them, can't you? I said, no, those were hand printed. Joseph Karsh printed 40 to 50 maximum prints. The print of Churchill, I'm going to say there were about 30. I said, take a guess, what do you think that print is worth? And he said, oh, I don't know, a few $1,000s. I said, that print is worth about $40,000. He said, I always remember, he said, oh, if we had only known these prints were worth that much money, we would have had better security. And I went, oh my God. But yeah, so they now, just out of curiosity, and just so you know, they have extreme security. If you don't even try it. but it just sort of said to me, wow, people don't understand photography. They don't understand my profession. And of course, even less so today, because of course, what happens is that the amount of theft and whatnot that goes on, the amount of stuff that I see that happens to me is wild. And that's just, again, another somewhat nail in the coffin of my industry, sad to say, but that's just life. Things change, things grow, you grow with it, you adapt, you deal with it, you try to protect yourself, but business changes, simple as that. As I've said, I'm a survivor in a business that has a massive attrition rate, primarily by being stubborn, I think, but also by pivoting multiple times, looking to the future to see where things are going and making, hopefully, intelligent decisions.